My name is Elise Carter, and for a long time I believed that doing your job well was enough to make people notice your value. I was wrong. Sometimes the hardest working person in the room is the one everyone overlooks, especially when their work happens quietly, behind the scenes, without applause or a dramatic presentation. This conversation, the business expansion they were planning, or even the reason they had sounded frustrated when important milestones were approaching, and sometimes called clients simply to ask whether everything was going smoothly. I believed that if customers knew someone inside the company actually cared about their success, they would be less likely to leave. My manager, Victoria Hale, considered that approach unnecessary and unprofessional. She often told me that I was wasting time by becoming too emotionally involved with clients. In her opinion, business relationships should be efficient, formal, and transactional. "We are not here to make friends," she would say whenever she saw me spending extra time on a client call. "We are here to close contracts." I never argued with her. I simply kept doing my work. For almost a year, I quietly rebuilt relationships with clients who had once been preparing to leave us. One important account had nearly canceled after a major service problem, but I stayed in contact with their director for weeks, making sure their concerns were addressed. Another client had stopped responding to our emails, but after I remembered that he preferred phone calls to written communication, I reached him directly and eventually secured a renewal. Then there were the referrals. One satisfied customer recommended us to another company, which eventually signed a large contract. Slowly, without me realizing it, our retention numbers began climbing. Month after month, fewer clients canceled. More contracts were renewed. More companies contacted us through referrals. Eventually, senior management announced that the department had achieved the strongest retention rate in company history. Everyone celebrated. Victoria stood in front of the department proudly presenting the numbers, as if they had appeared because of her management strategy. She never mentioned my name. Instead, a few days later, she called me into her office and handed me a new assignment. "I want a complete report on your client relationship process," she said. "Every contact, every follow-up, every result. I want to understand exactly what you have been doing." I knew immediately that she was not asking because she wanted to learn from me. She wanted proof that my methods were as wasteful as she had always claimed. Still, I accepted the assignment. For weeks, I stayed late documenting everything. I created a detailed record showing how conversations led to renewals, how personal follow-ups prevented cancellations, how referrals turned into new contracts, and how long-term trust had produced additional revenue. When I finally finished, the report contained hundreds of pages of notes, timelines, client histories, renewal records, and financial comparisons. The numbers were undeniable. My approach had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional business. I walked into Victoria's office expecting at least a little recognition. Instead, she flipped through the pages for less than 5 minutes, closed the report, and said, "This is exactly what I was talking about. It is clutter. You have confused customer service with business strategy." I reminded her that the numbers clearly showed the strategy was working. She stared at me and smiled coldly. Numbers can be manipulated to tell any story. Then she scheduled a department meeting and told me that my report would be reviewed in front of the entire team. The meeting took place on a Thursday afternoon. 20 employees sat around a conference table, while Victoria connected her laptop to the large screen at the front of the room. I knew what was coming, but I still was not prepared for how personal it would become. She opened my client relationship database and started scrolling through it. "This," she said, pointing at the screen, "is what happens when someone does not understand professional boundaries." She read aloud notes about clients' preferences, communication habits, concerns, important dates, and personal details they had voluntarily shared during conversations. Some of my coworkers looked uncomfortable. Others stared at the table. Victoria continued, "Why does this database contain information about how a client prefers to be contacted? Why are there notes about their family? Why did you call this customer after the weekend when there was no contract deadlines up?" Before I could understand what she meant, she selected the entire archive and pressed delete. My heart stopped. Hundreds of pages of notes, years of relationship history, follow-up records, reminders, and documented conversations disappeared from the screen. She sat back in her chair and said, "Now that is what I call a professional database." A few people gasped. Someone quietly said, "Victoria, maybe you should have backed that up first." She shrugged. "We don't need all that unnecessary information." I stared at the blank screen. I felt humiliated, angry, and strangely empty all at once. For months, I had poured everything I had into building those relationships. In less than a minute, she had erased the visible evidence of that work in front of everyone. When the meeting ended, I returned to my desk, packed my things, and went home without speaking to anyone. That night, I sat in my apartment thinking about everything that had happened. I kept hearing Victoria's voice telling me that my work did not matter. But then I remembered something she had forgotten. She had deleted the records, not the relationships. The clients still knew me. They still had my phone number. They still remembered the conversations we had. They still remembered the times I stayed late to solve a problem, the calls I made when something went wrong, and the fact that I treated them like people rather than account numbers. My value had never truly existed inside that database. The database was simply evidence of something much more important. The next afternoon, something happened that changed my life. My phone rang, and the caller introduced himself as the director of a competing consulting firm. He told me that he had been monitoring industry retention results and had noticed our extraordinary numbers over the previous year. He said he had also heard about the work I had been doing with clients. I was cautious. I asked how he knew my name. He laughed softly and replied, "Because the people who work with your clients keep mentioning it." Then he offered me a senior position with a salary almost twice what I was making. I was stunned. I asked him why he wanted me when he could simply hire someone with more management experience. His response stayed with me forever. "We don't want your company's information, Elise. We want the person who created the trust behind those numbers." The next morning, I walked into Victoria's office and handed her my resignation letter. She looked at the paper, then at me, and started laughing. "You are actually leaving?" she asked, "for a smaller competitor?" I told her that I had accepted another opportunity. She leaned back in her chair and said, "You are making a huge mistake. They are never going to give you the security you have here." I thanked her for the advice, picked up my bag, and turned toward the door. She called after me, "You will regret this." I stopped for a moment, turned around, and said quietly, "Maybe, but at least I will be somewhere that understands why customers stay." Then I walked out. I did not take a single confidential file. I did not copy a single client list. I did not email myself company documents. I did not steal anything that belonged to my former employer. I left with nothing except my experience, my reputation, and the trust I had earned. On my first day at the new company, I was nervous. The office was smaller, the team was younger, and the systems were unfamiliar. But for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. My new manager asked me to describe how I built client relationships, and instead of telling me to be less personal, he said, "Show us how you do it." I started from scratch. I called clients, introduced myself, listened to their concerns, and learned about their goals. I did not mention my previous employer or encourage anyone to leave them. I simply did my job. 3 weeks later, something unexpected happened. A former client called my new office. He had found my new contact information independently and asked whether I was available to speak with him. I helped him with a proposal, and a few days later, another former client reached out. Then another. I never contacted them first. I never asked them to follow me. They simply discovered that the person they trusted was now somewhere else. One client told me, "We don't care what company you work for. We care that you are the person who understands us." That sentence stayed in my mind. Within 2 months, several major accounts requested proposals from my new company. None of them had been stolen. None Looking back, I realized that the most important lesson from that experience had nothing to do with money, promotions, or even proving someone wrong. It was about understanding where true value lives. Victoria believed my work existed inside a spreadsheet. She thought that if she deleted the notes, the reminders, and the database, she had erased the evidence that my methods mattered. What she never understood was that the real work had never been stored in the computer. It lived in the memory of every client I had helped. It lived in the trust of people who knew that when they called, someone would listen. It lived in the businesses that stayed because they felt respected. It lived in the referrals that came because customers believed I cared about their success. She could delete a database, but she could not delete a reputation. She could erase notes, but she could not erase memories. She could remove my name from an internal system, but she could not remove me from the relationships I had built through years of honesty and dedication. That experience also taught me something about quiet employees. Sometimes the people doing the most important work are not the loudest people in the office. They are the ones who stay late without announcing it, who solve problems before anyone notices them, who remember details that others consider unimportant, and who keep customers happy without expecting recognition. Because their work is invisible, people can easily mistake it for weakness. They can assume that because someone is quiet, they must not be. The best response is not revenge. The best response is growth. Keep moving forward. Keep doing meaningful work. Keep building relationships that matter. Because one day, the people who tried to erase your contribution may discover that what they thought was replaceable was actually the very thing holding everything together. Thank you for listening to my story. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining, emotional, and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue bringing you more powerful stories like this one.